now, so you know this is recorded. We're extremely excited to launch the Polycon UK webinar series for the academic year 2022-2023 with Thomas Piketty. So Thomas needs no introduction, but I'm still going to give it a little go. So Thomas Piketty is a professor at the UHS, Centennial Professor at the LSE, and he's done just an uncountable number of contributions in the field of inequality, and his book, Capital in the 21st Century, has been considered like one of the most important books in the 21st century in economics. So today he's going to be talking to us about his more recent book, A Brief History of Equality. So Thomas, the floor is yours. For question today, you can interrupt. If it gets a little bit unmanageable, we'll switch towards questions in the chat. Okay?
Okay, thanks a lot, Valeria. I should be clear that I have been teaching at LSE in the past, but I have never been permanent at LSE, so just to correct this. Except when I was a student 30 years ago, but that was a long time. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this new book of mine, A Brief History of Equality. Oh, Valeria, can you remind me, you want to hear me for how long, approximately?
1 hour.
1 hour, yeah, okay.
1 hour recorded.
Including potential interruption and question. Okay,
yes,
that's
exactly.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about this new book, which is an attempt to a sort of short synthesis of some of my previous books, and I will be clearer about that in a minute. But before I tell you more about this book, let me start with a little bit of background about what we know about global inequality today and global inequality trends. And so I'm going to start with a few slides just to summarize some of the findings that we recently presented in this World Inequality Report 2022, which is a sort of big report that we publish at the World Inequality Lab at PSE every 4 years. So we did one in 2018. So this one is 2022 and was just released a few months ago. You can get all the full report online easily. So what we do in this report is we take some of the data from the World Inequality Database, which is sort of this big collective project that we started with Tony Atkinson and Emmanuel Saez and Facundo Alvarado more than 10 years ago now. Well, it's all started almost 20 years ago after I did my historical work on top income shares in France, and then in the US with Emmanuel Saez, and then with Tony Atkinson and Britain. And anyways, a large part due to Tony, this sort of became a big collective international research project, and there are now over 100 researchers from all over the world involved in this project. So we started looking at income inequality, and then recently, and in particular in the new World Inequality Report, we've moved toward wealth inequality, to some extent gender inequality, and carbon emission inequality. And I want to give you a quick snapshot of these different dimensions of global inequality before moving to my book. So that's a first world map, which you can find with a very simple indicator of income inequality, which is the share of national income going to the top 10% of the population. So just to get the orders of magnitude right, get 10% of total income. If you had complete inequalities, they should get 100%. So of course, the reality is always between 10 and 100. But the first message I want you here to remember is that it varies quite a lot. It goes from almost 20 to 70. So, it doesn't go from 10 to 100. But, if you take the most equal country, which would be in Nordic Europe, you will get between 25 and 30% of total income for the top 10. If you take South Africa, you will have almost 70% of total income for the top 10. So you have huge variation. Then you have, Latin America, Brazil, or Chile, or Mexico will be between 60 and 70%. So you have enormous variation. So that's first finding. Second finding is that you also have a lot of historical variation. So if you take, Europe today looks relatively equal, and even the US looks equal, at least less unequal than South Africa or Brazil or India or the Middle East. But it's not always been like that. So if you know, there's been a movement toward relatively more equality of income and to a lesser extent of wealth in the long run. And this movement toward relatively more equal distribution of income in the long run has come with more economic prosperity, with more economic growth. So the most advanced countries in the world, in particular in Europe and to some extent North America, Japan, have moved toward more equality over the course of history, you know, so in particular during the 20th century, at the same time as they were becoming richer and richer. So for instance, in the case of Europe, you know, today you have, you know, around 25, 30 or between 30 and 35% in some European countries of total income going to the top 10%. 1 century ago, so before World War I, it was not South Africa, but it was sort of close to Latin America today. So between 50 and 60% of total income will go to the top 10%. So, you know, things are not frozen, you know, they have changed a lot over time. An example which I describe a lot in my book is the example of Sweden, which used to be a very unequal country 1 century ago, with an incredibly unequal political system, with you know, in terms of voting rights, that you know, you could have up to 100 voting rights if you were wealthy enough. So you know, the idea that, you know, some countries are equal forever and some other unequal forever doesn't fly when you look at this data. You have enormous cross-sectional variation, but also enormous historical variation. So this is true if you look at the top 10% income share. Let me mention that this is also true, and in a way, maybe even more spectacular, when you look at the income share going to the bottom 50%. So again, these are 50% of the population. So if you had complete equalities, they should have 50% of total income. If you had complete inequalities, they should have 0. In practice, they always have between 0 and 50. They have, in practice, it goes from sort of 5 to 25, 30%. So, you know, when you have, so say if you're in Nordic Europe and you are the bottom 50% and you have 25% of total income, it means that your average income is about half of the average income of the entire population. So, you know, of course, you're poorer than average. After all, you are the bottom 50%, but you are not hugely poorer than average. If you're in South Africa, you have 5% of total income for the bottom 50%. So your average income is about 1/10 of average income. I should mention that all the incomes I'm reporting here are after most monetary transfer income, in particular after pension income, unemployment insurance. This does not include, however, in-kind transfer. We have other series in the World Inequality Report looking at after full redistribution, including in-kind redistribution. Okay, so this is for income inequality. Now, one of the big novelty in the World Inequality Report 2022 is that we also cover wealth inequality. And here, you know, the big message is basically that, you know, inequality is quite huge pretty much everywhere. So again, Europe looks more equal than the rest of the world. And you can see the middle 40%, which is the group between the top 10 and the bottom 50, which has a, you know, significant share of total wealth in Europe, which again was not the case 1 century ago. So there's been this movement toward more equality in the distribution of wealth as well, and not only for income. But now if you look at the bottom 50%, you can see that the bottom 50% wealth share is really incredibly small pretty much everywhere. So in Europe, it will be 4%. So this is better than Latin America or North America, where it will be 1% or 2%. Or it is better than Europe in the 19th century, where it will be 1 or 2%. But 4%, you know, for 50% of the population, that's very small. These are pretty much the same number within each age group. So it's not an age effect, you know, you look within people between 25 and 35 or over 60 or whatever, the numbers are very close to those you have here. So in particular, this means that this is roughly the distribution of inherited wealth. So, the bottom 50% of the population basically receives, a share in total inheritance that is close to zero. And so, that's one of the issues that I discuss in my book, A Brief History of Equality. Imagine you want to move toward more equal distribution of wealth. What can you do? Maybe, some form of redistribution of inheritance so that anybody has minimum inheritance, will be a way to make progress. And I will return to this in a minute. Now, in the World Inequality Report 2022, we also try to cover new dimensions of inequality. So one is gender inequality. So, it's a very rough indicator that we offer here, but at least, it can be computed for pretty much, every country in the world, at least for recent decades. So this is the share of women in total labor income, including wage income and self-employment income. So what you get basically is that inequality is pretty, if you use this kind of indicator, the picture looks sort of less nice than, when you look at gender gap for a given occupation, you get a gender gap of 10%, 10 to 20%, say in developed countries, which is already too much, but which doesn't look so bad. Now, of course, the problem is that women don't have access to the same occupation and top earning position as men, as we know, for all sorts of reasons. And now, if you look at the share in total income, it's going to reflect this, unequal access to different occupation together with gender gap for a given occupation. Therefore, you will have a view of gender inequality, which is less nice and in a way, I think, more meaningful. So, for instance, in Western Europe or in North America, the share of women today will be 37, 38% of total labor income, which gives 62, 63 for men. So, which is quite large. There's been some limited progress over time. You can see also huge variation across region, which, there will be a lot more to say about this, but, I'm not going to get into this here. And the last dimension of inequality, which is covered in the World Inequality Report, and which is also playing an important role in my most recent book, are the inequality in carbon emission within countries. So, of course, we all know about the huge inequality in carbon emission between countries, between the North and the South in particular. What we stress here is that there's also enormous inequality within the South, within the North. So if you take Europe, if you take the bottom 50% in terms of carbon emission today in Europe, they have an average emission around 5.1 ton of equivalent carbon emission. So this includes all the carbon content of imported goods minus export. So this takes this into account. Now 5.1 is still too much, and this should decline toward 4 or 3 or 2 in the coming decade, but it's not completely off the mark as compared to the targets for the coming decade. Whereas if you look at the top 10%, you will have an average emission of 29 tons. In North America, it's going to be 73. If you take the top 1%, it's going to be close to 100 in Europe, close to 200 in North America. The bottom line here is simply that, it's going to be difficult from a political economy perspective to get a significant reduction in aggregate carbon emission if you don't have at the same time a pretty drastic reduction in economic inequality, in the sense that, I think it's going to be difficult for people in the bottom to accept if you come with a plan with a huge proportional reduction and you treat everybody in the same manner and you ask everybody to have a big proportional reduction in their carbon emission through a big proportional carbon tax or a large increase in energy price, which is a little bit what we have today, there's a serious risk that you run into a major yellow vest type movement everywhere. That people in the bottom who have currently an emission of 5 will tell you, okay, we need to make change to our lifestyle, but first you should change drastically the level of emissions that you see at the top, people who have 30 tons, 100 tons. So, do you need to invent some kind of progressive carbon tax, treating very differently people who have an emission of 5, people who have an emission of 50, people who have an emission of 200? Can it be done indirectly through a reduction of income inequality, wealth inequality? It's probably better, if you have directly a progressive carbon tax. Although, the standard economic models, which typically make very optimistic assumption about the functioning of carbon markets, would prefer to do it through a reduction in income and wealth inequality and a proportional carbon tax, so as not to distort price. That would be the standard argument. And, not so sure from a political economy perspective that this really flies very well. But anyway, that's sort of part of the issues that I address also in my brief history of equality. So let me come now to the book. Yes, please, Valeria.
A little. So there's a question by Nora Sheh. I think
Please,
if you want to mute yourself, you can go ahead. So I
Yeah.
think especially about the per capita emissions, which we're less used to look at. Nora, do you want to ask it?
Sure. Tuma, my question is, how much of this is caused by work? So if I'm in the top 10%, how big is the chunk that I caused through work duties, that I have to fly maybe more and so on? You could say this is maybe a bit unavoidable compared to, what I privately consume.
So, in fact, this is not even taken into account, because what's when you take your plane to go to a conference at NBER, this will be counted as intermediate consumption paid by your university, your company. It will not be counted as your income and as your private consumption. So in fact, that's not even going to be counted, which, by the way, can be discussed. I think it's actually a problem that it's not counted. Well, in some cases, you could say, you're forced to, but, at some point, well, no, you are not forced to. And I think, in fact, that's one of the big limits of this kind of accounting thing, is that all the intermediate consumption part, is sort of reattributed to everybody as a proportion of their other form of consumption, but does not take into account the inequality in intermediate consumption. It can be a problem, because if you think of private jets, for instance, I think there are very few people that pay private jets out of their own pocket. I mean, I've not worked on that in a detailed manner, but I'm pretty sure that usually it's the company that pays for the private jet. So anyway, this raises other issues. Okay, so let me move on to this book. So a brief history of equality. So it's a relatively brief book. It's like 250 pages or something like that. So I think it can be read in a weekend or something like this. So this is much shorter. I have written 3 big books on the history of inequality over the past 20 years. My first one was my book in 2001 on top incomes in France in the 20th century, which sort of started the research programs on top incomes in the long run. Then I wrote Capital in the 21st Century in 2013, then Capital and Ideology in 2019. Now, each of these books is about 1,000 pages, 3,000 pages overall, and that's probably too long. I apologize for that. So, unless you are really passionate about the topic, you don't need to read them. But, if you have time, you could have a look at this one, this little one, 250 pages, where you will get a sort of snapshot of the, what I view as more important. So, for me, writing this shorter book was also a way, to try to clarify, what was really important and what was the most important finding in the end in this sort of big comparative historical research program on inequality, which has kept me busy for almost the past 20 years. And the key conclusions that I'm trying to stress in this new book, like the title indicates, is a sort of optimistic message, trying to stress that in the end, in the long run, there is a movement toward more equality. So it's a movement that comes from sometimes, enormous political mobilization, social struggle. So typically it starts at the end of the 18th century with the abolition of the privileges of the aristocracy during the French Revolution, which sort of marks the beginning of the end of societies based on privileges. The other major event at the same time is of course the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, which is going to set the beginning of the end of slave and colonial societies. Now, these two parallel movements, of course, are going to make a lot of progress in the 19th century with the abolition of slavery, with the rise of universal male suffrage, the rise of the labor movement. In the 20th century, with the rise of universal female suffrage, decolonization, social security, civic rights, end of apartheid, progressive taxation. And this movement is continuing today with the Me Too movement, with the Black Lives Matter movement. And the central message of the book is that this movement, of course, could and should continue, and to some extent, is continuing, in front of us. And so, this book is really an attempt to say, look, I guess I was a bit puzzled by the fact that some people, after reading Capital in the 21st Century, concluded. Okay, the reduction of inequality in the past was due to cataclysmic events like World War I, World War II, and without a major war, there is never any reduction of inequality. And I was a bit puzzled by this way of reading my results, because I'm not saying wars do not play any role, but I think the movement in the long run toward more equality is much deeper than this. And it started, again, much before World War I and World War II, say at the end of the 18th century. And it's continuing today. If you look at gender equality, or to some extent racial equality. And so that's what I'm trying to stress in this book. So in this presentation, I'm not going to present everything, but I want to stress some of these dimensions. So that's so this is a table of contents. So it's a short book, 250 pages, but it still has 10 chapters, which are each is about 20 or 25 pages long. So I start with the movement toward more equality in income and wealth, and which I already started to talk about a minute ago, and I will show you a bit more on this. Then I have several chapters on the legacy of slavery and colonialism, the question of reparation. In particular, I talk quite a bit about the case of Haiti, which had to pay France enormous reparation in order to compensate French slave owners for their loss of property following the independence of Haiti in 1804. There's a big issue today as to whether France should sort of give this money back to Haiti, which I think it should. So I'm not going to talk too much about this aspect in this presentation, but I'd be happy to answer questions if you want. I stress then this period of great redistribution during the 20th century, which is much longer than just World War I and World War II. And then by the end of the book, I try to discuss various possible continuation of this movement toward more equality in the long run, and sort of what are the key political economic forces that can push in this direction. So in the presentation today, I'm going to focus on a number of findings. The first finding I want to stress, and which I already mentioned a little bit when I talk about the World Inequality Report, is that in the long run you have a movement toward more equality of income and to some extent more equality of wealth if you take developed countries. So here I take the example of France, where we have particularly good data on wealth because the French Revolution organized a system of inheritance taxation and registration of property, which allows us to to measure wealth distribution quite well. But we have similar data for countries like Sweden, to some extent Britain, showing very similar evolution. So take this case of France as relatively representative of Western Europe. And what I want to stress is, okay, in the long run, there is a movement toward relatively more equality of income and wealth, but this movement is much more substantial for income than for wealth. When you look at wealth, look at this graph. So yeah, there has been a big decline of the share of total wealth going to the top 10%. And it comes mostly from a fall in the top 1%. And there has been a big increase in the wealth share of the middle 40%, which is a very significant change. But if you look at the bottom 50%, you're basically close to zero. I mean, you're about 4 or 5%. And so, there's been some movement, but it's quite, it's quite limited in the long run. This is representative of all European countries. So in particular, it was even more extreme if you look. So in this graph, I look at France, Britain, Sweden before World War I. So you can see that here it was really what I describe as extreme patrimonial inequality. So Sweden in particular was just as unequal as France and Britain, probably a little between the two from the data we have. Now this extreme concentration of wealth has declined over the past century. So if you compare Europe, so here I take an average of the various European countries. You take Europe 1913, Europe 2020. You can see this improvement in the share going to the middle 40%. But as far as the bottom 50% is concerned, it's still pretty, it's still very small. I compare the US here. So in the US, the rise in wealth inequality in recent decades has been more substantial than in Europe, and the share going to the middle 40% has declined more substantially. So it's still larger than what it was a century ago in the US, and even larger than what it was a century ago in Europe. But this is sort of going in the direction of a slow decline. It will probably not go as low as what it was 100 years ago, but still this is the picture. So you have this form of persistence of hyper-concentrated wealth. And so, one of the questions I ask in the book, could it be different? Should it be different? So, that's a very difficult question, of course, to answer. The message I try to emphasize in the book is that if you want to have a higher share of total wealth for the bottom 50%, just waiting for growth and market competition to do the job is probably not going to be enough, because we've had growth and market competition for 2 centuries, and you can see that the share going to the bottom 50% is close to zero. So one of the conclusion I try to push is that if you want this to change, probably you need to redistribute inheritance itself. So, the distribution of inheritance is roughly follows this kind of distribution that I described here, because you have roughly the same distribution of wealth within the people who are about to die than for the rest of the population. That's certainly one of the driving force for persistence in the very concentration of wealth. So, one solution would be a redistribution of inheritance so that everybody get a minimum inheritance. And, I'm not saying that's simple, but, that's, if we don't have something like this, probably this is not going to change too much. So if we try to understand in the past what did bring more equality in wealth for the middle class and also in income, to summarize a long story, but which you are all, I'm sure, very familiar with. The rise of the social state, what I call here the social state in general, is probably the most important explanation for the rise of more equality. And also, this also helps us to see immediately why the rise of more equality also came with more economic prosperity in the long run. So if you take typically the spending in education, they were incredibly small, until World War I. It was less than 0.5% of national income in pretty much every European countries. In the US, it was about 1% of national income at the time. So there was a significant educational advance already in the US as compared to Europe, but still it was relatively small as compared to what you see. So in the course of the 20th century, the educational spending go from 0.5% of national income to about 5-6% of national income. So this has been multiplied by 10. And that's probably one of the most important factors which explains both more equality, because of course the education systems that you have in the 19th century with so little resources are very elitist, or basically only a very small minority goes beyond primary school, and even primary schools themselves are not very well funded as compared to secondary higher education. The big rise of educational spending over the course of the 20th century has allowed for enormous expansion in universal access to primary education and secondary education, and to some extent tertiary education today. I should also mention that if you look at the stagnation of total educational investment in recent decades, since the 1980s, 1990s, it has stagnated between 5 and 6% of national income in basically all Western countries. This is sort of paradoxical, because of course the fraction of a generation going to higher education has increased a lot, which means that the spending per student has declined relatively to national income per capita, which I think if we want to understand growth slowdown in the long run, that's probably the most obvious candidate explanation, depending on how you write down your endogenous growth model and how increased education feeds into increased productivity, innovation, and finally self-sustained growth. If you have a stagnation of total education investment as compared to the previous period, it's easy to write down a model where this will give you a slowdown in productivity growth. And to me, if I look at the very big picture in the long run, that's pretty much the best story we have. So last thing I also want to stress about this is that in the middle of the 21st century, you still have a very large educational advance between the US and Europe. Typically in the 1950s, you have 90% of a cohort going to secondary school in the US, whereas in Europe, whether you look at Germany, France, Sweden, or also in Japan, it's between 20 and 30% of a cohort. And I think that's also probably the most important explanation for the huge income gap between US and Europe at the time, and the convergence in educational level between 1950 and the 1990s is again probably the most important explanation for closing the gap. Now, in terms of reduction of inequality, the other powerful force.
We have another question.
Yeah, sure.
About so Nora, do you want to ask, and then I have a follow-up question as well.
Yeah, Thomas, I mean, we also in Germany face this problem. Everybody is a bit worried. There will be a kind of yellow vest movement with the energy crisis and everything now happening. So my question would be, do you have a suggestion how to redistribute, but faster, not with education, because this will last a long time, right? Do you have an idea how to redistribute in a way that also rich people will hopefully accept that? Yeah, well, no, that's for the last point, that's not possible.
if you wait for the aristocrats to accept the end of privileges at the time of the French Revolution, then it's not going to work. You cannot have unanimity about these things. So the last part, unfortunately, is impossible. I mean, you can try to convince part of the billionaires, of course, but if you put as a condition that you need unanimity, that's that's not going to get you very far. But apart from this point, I think you're right. In the short run, the solution is much more through monetary redistribution of income and wealth rather than education. And I will actually come back to this a bit later. But what I want to stress here is that in the long run, this educational investment and this redistribution of education is, in the end, even more important, because this is what leads to more equality in the primary distribution of income, even without any transfer. And in the long run, this is what we see. In the long run, the reason why, say, Europe has become more equal today as compared to 100 years ago, or Europe is more equal than the US today, it's not because of transfer. It's entirely at the level of primary distribution of income. So that's really something I want to stress. Valeria, you also wanted to ask?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. So one is a first clarification question for this graph. So this is really the amount that's spent by the state. So as a public good. Okay, yeah, so that clarifies. So here in the UK, obviously there's a lot of these goods that, they're pushed for the upper middle class to be substituted by private services, right? So it'd be nice to have a little bit of your views on that, especially for health and education. And my second question was, so you also mentioned in the previous slide, the importance of taxing inheritance. And I just wondered if you were going to say a little bit more about, tools that make that feasible, in view of the amount of fiscal evasion that there is in Europe and in the US.
Mm-hmm. Let me. I'm going to get to that about progressive taxation in a minute. So I'm going to answer this in a minute. Now, here I focus on public education, public health, because this has really been the redistributive component. Because the public part has been, well, not exactly lump sum, but closer to lump sum at least than the private part. And so this has contributed to more equality in a way that private spending does not. Regarding progressive taxation, so just a quick, brief recapitulation of the history of progressive taxation. Okay, so before World War I, there was very little progressive taxation. Then you can see, top income tax rate increased enormously. So as we all know, they were led by, in particular, the United States, which, between 1930 and 1980 had on average a top income tax rate of 81%. So sometimes it was 90, sometimes it was only 70, but on average it was 80%. This is only the federal income tax. You also have state income tax rate together. So, apparently this did not destroy American capitalism. Otherwise we would have noticed it. And if anything, the GDP per capita, national income per capita, and the productivity gap between the US and the rest of the world was at its highest level, in the 50s, 60s when this was set up. And to me, looking at this comparative data, it is really time to revisit this experience. And the general lesson to me is that income gaps of 1 to 50, 1 to 100, or 1 to 200 are simply not very useful in terms of productivity, in terms of economic growth. So I'm not saying that you can have no income gap at all. Maybe you need income gap of 1 to 5, 1 to 10. Some people would say 1 to 20. I think 1 to 5, 1 to 10 is probably enough. That's my reading of the evidence. But in any case, this enormous top tax rate, which reduce very large income gaps, typically of 1 to 50 or 1 to 100, which existed at the time, did not hurt economic growth in a country like the US. Why is it so? Because, I think the true source of economic prosperity in the long run is much more education than enormous inequality. And the fact that the US was an educational leader in the middle of the 20th century is really what mattered to explain the huge income gap, and very large progressive taxation in itself was not a problem. Now in the 1980s, there was a promise to cut this top income tax rate in order to boost economic growth. So this was done for the top income tax rate. This was done also, so here I don't have the graph for inheritance tax, but this also happened for inheritance tax. Now, what happened? So if you look in the US, so you have in red the evolution of the top income tax rate. So, this was roughly divided by 2, following the Reagan decade in the 1980s. In principle, this was supposed to boost economic growth. So typically the claim was, we are going to have faster growth, or maybe you will have more inequality, but, the pie is going to grow so much faster than everybody is going to benefit from it, and the income and wages of average Americans are going to grow so fast that everybody is going to benefit from it. Well, in practice, what we've seen is that the growth rate of national income per capita in the US was actually divided by 2 following the Reagan decade, which I'm not saying at all that this was divided by 2 because the top income tax rate was divided by 2, of course. But I think the true reason for growth slowdown is more the slowdown in educational investment, as I said. But at the very least, what one should infer from this is that the very high top income tax rate of the previous period were not a problem for growth, and also the fact that you divide them by 2 in itself is clearly not sufficient to boost economic growth. The case of the US is particularly interesting because the 1950-1990 period was not particularly exceptional for the US. It's not like European post-war reconstruction. For the US, it's actually very close growth performance and what we had in 1910, 1950, or 1870, 1910. So what's really exceptionally bad are the recent decades. So how can we move forward from this legacy? So I already mentioned the issue of redistribution of inheritance. So this is getting to the previous discussion. So this is a simple simulation where assume you have a minimum inheritance at age 25. So here it will be equal to 120,000 euros for all at age 25, which is about 60% of average per adult wealth in France right now, or in Western Europe in general. So average per adult wealth will be 200,000 euros. So here everybody at age 25 will get 60% of that, 120,000 euros. So just to make it clear, people who receive 0, which is typical, roughly the bottom 50%, would get 120,000. People who now receive 1 million, which is roughly the average of the top 10%, will still receive 600,000 after the progressive inheritance tax and also the annual progressive wealth tax for the most part that's paying for this. So, we will still be very far from equality of opportunity because you still will have people who receive 120,000, some other people 600,000, and some other people even more than that. And if you want my opinion, I think we could and we should go much further in this direction. But at the very least, this is the kind of transformation which will give a substantial share of total inherited wealth for the bottom 50%. So, here they will get more than 30% of total inherited wealth. And, I'm not saying this is going to be simple to implement, the political economy of this is complicated. What I'm saying is, 2 things. First, if you don't have something like this, then, probably the distribution of wealth is going to remain, very, very unequal, very concentrated, like it is today. my point number 2 is that, all the transformations that have happened over the past century, in particular, this enormous rise of the social state or welfare state, or enormous rise of progressive taxation in the 20th century, if you had told someone, in 1910 that this was going to happen, everybody would have said, impossible, this will be communism, this will be, the end of economic productivity, or at least the biggest part of the elite would have said that. And, in the end, not only it happened, but in fact, it came together with much more economic prosperity than what we ever had before. So I think, what I'm trying to do in this book is take this long run perspective and say, okay, look at the enormous institutional transformations that have happened in the past, which were completely impossible from the point of view of someone in 1900, let alone someone before the French Revolution. But, all these transformations have been enormous. What kind of similar transformation could we think of in the future that will continue this movement? Then, the kind of political mobilization that it will take, I can say a few more words about this in a minute, but, I'm of course completely unable to predict, how this could happen. But I just want to stress that this seems completely, off the map and completely enormous, but, the past evolution that I have just documented over the past 2 centuries were also completely off the map, as compared to the, conventional wisdom and in particular the elite discourse of the previous period. So, I think it's important to have this in mind when we look at the future. So, redistribution of inheritance is one of the issue I discuss, and another issue I discuss in the book is, what about, power sharing in companies and economic democracy? So, if you look at what happened in the past, you see that some countries, in Sweden or Germany, have granted, starting in the 1950s, up to 50% of board seats in the boards of large companies for worker representative, which, did not always make a big difference, because in practice you always have a 50% plus 1 for the shareholders. It still makes a difference in the sense that if in addition to that workers have 10 or 20% of the shares of the company, or if a local government, a regional government has 10 or 20% of the shares of the companies, you can shift the majority, including if you have a shareholder who has 80 or 90% of the stock. And I can tell you that from a point of view of a shareholder in France or in the US or in Britain, where this transformation did not happen, this is already almost like communism, except that this happened in Germany, this happened in Sweden, and I think overall this worked relatively well in the sense that it allowed to involve workers in the long-term strategy of companies in a way that is not always perfect, but that is certainly not worse than what we have when workers are not involved. So again, question, what can we do more in this direction? What can we imagine? What other institutional transformation can we imagine in the future? So here I describe a system where you would apply the same sort of co-determination or co-management rules to all companies, small or large, so not only in large companies, and also where you would introduce a maximum number of voting rights for large shareholders in large companies, so that in effect, even a single shareholder, so this is what you have in this graph, even a single shareholder who is a firm employee would lose his absolute majority in voting rights as the firm gets bigger. Again, this is not a kind of transformation which I think is going to happen next week or is going to happen easily. I'm doing the same exercise as for inheritance. I look at the institutional transformations that happened in the 20th century, and I'm sort of asking, what could be the sort of next long-run evolution. And the other, important dimension is about educational justice and access to higher education. So this brings us back to the question by Valeria, which, we've made a lot of progress historically in terms of universal access to primary and then secondary education. When it comes to higher education, we're still in a situation of enormous inequality in terms of access to higher education, and also enormous hypocrisy, I would say, in the sense that, we all talk about equal opportunity, etc., but, when we look at this kind of data, so this is data collected by Emmanuel Saez and Raj Chetty in the US, where they link up the social security numbers of the parents and the students. So you can see, if you plot the percentile of parental income and rate of access to higher education, you get almost the 45-degree line. Not quite. If your parents are very poor, you still have a 25% chance to make it. And if your parents are very rich, you only have a 95% to make it. But, it's almost the 45-degree line. And of course, this is underestimating the true inequality in terms of access to higher education, because people who go to colleges in the bottom of the distribution don't go at all to the same colleges and people in the top of the distribution. So if you look at the amount received in educational investments, that will be even more extreme. So this is what I do for the next graph, where I look at the case of France, where, so here, Valeria, I only look at public educational investment. And you can see that, the fact that it's public in itself does not guarantee equality. So basically what you have here, it's a different kind of representation. I rank children from a given cohort. So this is for the latest cohort, those who graduate about today. I rank them by the total educational investment that they receive from primary school to higher education. And so on average, total investment is received by children right now in France. Public investment, educational investment is about 120,000 euros, but it goes from 60, 70,000. This will be people who exit education at age 17 or 18, to 200, 250, it will be individuals who go to the most elitist French grande école, or better funded education curricula. And people in the middle will be the people who go to university, standard university education, which are not so well funded in France. So you can see in the end, that the gap between the bottom and the top is around 200,000 euros. So, this is substantial. This is comparable to average inheritance, average inherited wealth. So this is like another inheritance, except that it's paid by public money, mostly to people who have, more socially favored origin. The correlation is not perfect, but of course, people who go to the top schools on average tend to have wealthier parents than people who don't. So what's the solution here? I think the solution is to be much more serious about the measurement of educational justice, and to set targets so that we make progress toward real educational equality in terms of how much you invest for the different children. I think we should also think about schemes where people who exit the school system early can either return to the school system using some special allowance for that, or sometimes convert some of this money into a supplement to the universal inheritance system I was describing before. In any case, that's clearly an area in which a lot of progress has to be made. Now, to put things again into a broader historical perspective, and to get closer to the conclusion, if we look at the distribution of educational investment in long-run perspective, there has been some progress in the long run. So there has been some progress, if you compare France 1910, France 2020. And it's even more spectacular, of course, when you compare to, so here I have put Algeria 1950, which is sort of the paradigmatic example of a colonial society, where you have basically complete separation between, the children of the colonizers and the children of the colonized. So Algeria 1950 is a good example. So here I'm using budgetary data from colonial Algeria that has been collected by Denis Cognot, one of my colleagues at PSE, who is actually very soon publishing a book on the history of the French colonial empires from the point of view of colonial budget. And so this is the kind of data that they have been collecting. So basically, the top 10% of children in French Algeria are roughly the children of the Europeans, so mostly the children of the French, who have a separate school system. So, you know, it's like the US South at about the same time, where you have essentially a discriminated system. You know, I think it's probably even worse in French Algeria 1950, in the sense that the budget, when you look at how much money was invested in the school for the Europeans, you get this incredible number, which is, you know, more than 80% of the total budget for 10% of the children, you know, which is something that is hard to believe in a way, but which sort of illustrates the kind of powerful forces for extreme inequalities that you can have in extreme inequality setting, like a colonial setting. I think it's also important to have this in mind, because, you know, sometimes in France or maybe in Britain, when we talk about segregation and discrimination and the legacy of racial inequality, you know, we tend to consider, at least many people in France tend to consider that, okay, segregation is an issue for the US and discrimination is an issue for the US, but, you know, in France, there's never been a legal segregation. Well, you know, not quite. If you look at the colonial empire, which all the implication about the, you know, post-colonial inequality today, you know, this is what you get. So again, you know, the big picture is, in the long run, there's been some progress. You know, if you look France 2020, it looks almost equal. You know, the top 10% of children is receiving only 20% of spending. The bottom 50% is receiving almost 35% of spending. Of course, except that the bottom 50% is 5 times more numerous than the top 10. So in fact, this data for France 2020 is the same as this one, so which is not particularly equal. But, you know, as compared to 1910, where you had an incredibly elitist educational system, and of course, as compared to a colonial society, it looks very equal. So, you know, you have this tension between the fact that there is a very deep movement toward more equality in the long run, but, you know, we're still very, very far. Which, you know, brings me to my conclusion, where I also, you know, continuing on the sort of colonial and post-colonial dimension. What's very striking when you look at income gap between countries in the long run is that we are only at the beginning of a sort of exit from a, you know, enormous level of colonial era inequality. So here, this is a simple indicator looking at the ratio between the average income in the top 10% richest country and the bottom 50% poorest country. You can see the beginning of a decline around 1980, 1990, partly driven by China and other very fastly developing countries. But, you know, this is still today, you know, much, much bigger than what it was, you know, at the beginning of the 19th century, at the beginning of modern colonialism. And, you know, if we'll, you know, I'm sorry for accelerating a little bit and jumping to the conclusion. If we look at the, you know, development opportunities for the global South and the global North, you know, in the coming years, of course, you know, a big issue, you know, coming back to carbon emission is going to be that an enormous fraction of historical emission, but also an enormous fraction of recent emission, if you look at top individual emitters, still come from the West. And so here, you know, one of the big issues is going to be, you know, when we talk about international tax reform and, you know, minimum tax on multinationals, is this simply a game for the North, you know, for countries between the North, you know, to split between themselves the tax base that's currently located in tax haven, which, you know, you could say that's better than nothing at all? Or is this an opportunity to go much further, which is to split some of the tax revenue coming from the most powerful economic actors in the world, big multinationals, world billionaire, you know, high income household, to split at least a fraction of this tax revenue between the North and the South, you know, in proportion to the population of each country and maybe in proportion to the exposition to climate change. Now, how is this going to happen? I'm going to stop there. I think if you look at the movement toward more equality in the past, there are two major driving forces. One is political mobilization through new political organization, political parties, trade unions. The other driving force is geopolitical competition between competing powers. So the fact that European colonial powers were in competition with one another, and somehow they all contributed to self-destroy each other between World War I and World War II. Contributed in the end to the weakening of capitalist elites. This is not exactly the best possible mechanism, but this is what happened. Competition with the Soviet bloc was very costly for people living in the Soviet Union, but this certainly contributed also to some of the social fiscal reforms that we've seen in the West. So if we look at the future, I think competition with China, to some extent competition with Russia, can also be one of the driving forces that forces Western countries to share some of the wealth and some of the tax revenue with the South. If they don't do that, the influence of China, in particular in the South, will grow larger and larger. So this is a very different kind of geopolitical competition than the one of the 20th century, but I think this is a part of the global forces that can shift attitude toward global inequality, together with global warming, which I think in itself has the potential to transform very fast attitudes toward inequality. I was mentioning earlier the issue of private jets. I think after another 2 or 3 or 5 summers of global climate catastrophe, I think the public opinion in the West and all over the world can turn very quickly against people who keep giving lessons to the entire world while using their private jet every day and then doing space tourism or these kind of things. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So please join me in thanking Thomas for being with us today. We have roughly 10 minutes of extra questions. We will stop the recording now.